Hello everyone, my name is Toby Horrorboy and I like customizing animatronics to look like different characters. So far I've made stuff from FNAF, Sallyface and the Walton Files, but I have so many more plans. And Candymare from the My Little Pony Grimdark story, Something Sweet to Bite, has been hugely requested. So I'm going to give you guys a tiny bit of backstory on this animatronic, and then we're going to jump straight into making Candymare. So Candymare has a super detailed design, and you can really just do anything you like with it. And because of this, I wanted to use a really big animatronic for her so I could get all of that detailing in there. So this is a FurReal Friends Butterscotch. She is about 3 feet or a meter tall. So she's much bigger than anything else I've worked on. I live in Melbourne, Australia, and we were actually in lockdown when I was first starting this project. So most stores were closed and I couldn't travel. I'd actually found someone selling a butterscotch and put down a deposit on her, but it could have been months before I managed to go and pick her up. And then one day during lockdown, I was outside going for a little walk and I looked up and I saw a butterscotch in hard rubbish. I actually spoke to the family that were throwing her out. They were super happy that I was taking her. They were moving house and they couldn't keep her. And if you're sitting there thinking, hey, that kind of sounds a bit familiar, it's because it's the plot of one of the Fazbear Fright stories. So I think that makes me a FNAF protagonist. So this butterscotch obviously had a fair bit of damage. Her tail had snapped off and both of her ears were just gone. On top of that, her lower jaw was just completely broken. It was just hanging on by the wires. And after I'd picked her up in my arms and walked back several blocks to my house, I realized that she was missing her battery box. And that is significant because it meant that I couldn't put batteries in her to see if she worked. So please keep in mind that for the first chunk of this project, I was working on her with the knowledge that she might not turn on at the end. These animatronics are pretty complex. She could have an issue with her neck movement. She could have an issue with her ears moving or her tail. She might not turn on at all. And I did eventually get that second butterscotch, so I'm going to tell you guys right now, she works. But with that in mind, I was procrastinating doing anything too permanent to her. So the first thing I did was cut a peppermint out of foam, and that gets stuck to her back upper leg. I really didn't want to start gluing stuff down to this butterscotch just to find out in a month or two that she wasn't going to work at all. So the circumstances of this whole project are just kind of weird. Once our peppermint is all cut out, it's time to use a Dremel to shape it and sand it down a little bit. The point of this was to round the edges a little bit so that it looked more like a peppermint candy. Unfortunately, butterscotch is so big that she barely fit on my desk and I did a lot of work underneath her. So I had pretty limited space, but don't worry, that does change later. Once we're done with the Dremel, we just use a sanding block to get those last few bumps out. Then it's time to get out the heat gun. Heat guns are really fantastic for working with foam because you can both heat seal them and heat form them. Heat sealing is a process you should do on foam that you've sanded. It basically just makes the foam a little bit less porous so it'll take the paint easier. And heat forming is when you heat up your foam and bend it into a certain shape. I use a heat gun for both of those things all of the time with animatronics and with cosplay. So I'm explaining it now because you're going to be seeing it a lot. I apparently did most of the heat forming off camera, so sorry about that. But this is the heat sealing and forming stage. After that, we need to seal our foam again, but this time with Mod Podge. Mod Podge is basically just PVA glue. So whether you have Mod Podge or PVA glue, you can just add a little bit of water, mix it up and paint it on. And that will also help to make the foam a little bit less porous and give you a much nicer surface to paint on. And you typically want to do 2 to 3 coats of Mod Podge on the whole thing. It's also important to note that Mod Podge dries clear. It's a really great product. I actually also use it as a sealant a lot of the time after painting. And once the Mod Podge is dry, it's time to actually paint the peppermint. So we put down just a flat white base first, and then we draw out where all of our sections are going to be. And yes, I did have to Google what a peppermint looks like. We start off by marking the center and then sectioning out each piece. Once we've got our sections drawn out, we can paint the red straight on. This Candymare animatronic took a really long time to make, and it was due to a lot of things, because I wasn't sure if the animatronic worked and because I work full time and some days I was too sick. And honestly, a lot of it was just that she has so many little pieces to make. And you're going to start seeing as we progress through this video that there is just so much going on. But that is okay because I like making stuff and Miss Candymare is worth it. The peppermint still needs to be gloss coated, but we put it aside for now. Because where are we going to stick the peppermint onto if she doesn't have any skin? Normally when I skin an animatronic, I try and keep as much of the fur intact as possible to use it as a pattern later on. But unfortunately, this butterscotch was not in good condition. The fur and the plastic under the fur was very dirty and she'd visibly been rained on. There was just quite a lot of dust between her fur and the base animatronic, and I didn't want to get any of that on our nice new fabric. So instead, I made a mock-up using some leftover fleece and some duct tape. The fabric I chose for her skin was a nursery fleece because it has a very short pile. So it's not like a fur, but it still visibly has a little bit of fluff. So Candymare's body is 2 pieces, and that's what we're cutting out right now. The 2 big round bits that you can see cut out are going to be the leg holes. Then we can sew up our center front and center back seams. This is what it looks like on. We can't sew up most of the underside because we still don't have the battery compartment and I don't know exactly how big it's going to be, but we can at least hand sew up the front underside of her just under her chest. And then we can hand sew that to the front chest piece. Normally I would have machine sewn this, but I wouldn't have physically been able to get it onto her body. With that done, it's time to cover her legs as well. So we use the same method as the body, we just pattern it from scrap fleece. I started with the back legs because they're a bit bigger, and we're just going to cut out those pieces and then carefully hand sew it on using an understitch. I wanted Candymare to sort of look as realistic as possible, so I didn't want to have any visible stitches. And then we just repeat the process for the front legs. And this is probably coming up to the time where I got the second Butterscotch animatronic, because this part is permanent. It is time to paint her hooves, but they were a little bit dirty, so first of all I cleaned them up with just a spray, and then we're going to use some sandpaper just to scuff them up a tiny bit so that the paint sticks better. As you can see, the underside of her hooves are already pretty scratched. And then we can start painting them. I don't know why, but every time I paint something, I do the first coat in like a super dark shade of that color. I don't do it on purpose, but it always happens. But it's okay, because I get to that light pink color in the end. And then we just do 1 or 2 coats of Mod Podge to seal our paint in. And those are our hooves, all painted and nice and shiny. Now, you might have noticed that we only made the upper legs earlier. And this is where Candymare not really having a set sort of design comes into play. Every artist that draws her a little bit differently. So at this point, I just kind of start doing whatever I think will look cool. And some of that is from like pretty consistent themes in art of her, or just stuff I thought would be fun. I wanted one of Candymare's front legs to be a waffle, and we're going to make it out of 1mm thick craft foam. But before we can do that, we have to make a pattern. So what I'm doing here is like a pretty common technique for like fursuiters and cosplayers. Complex and really three-dimensional shapes can be pretty hard to pattern on just like a flat piece. So you wrap the thing you want a pattern of in cling film and then cover it in duct tape. And then when you cut it off, you have your pattern piece. And the duct tape isn't going to stick to anything because there's cling film there. I decided to place the seams at the front and back of the leg, meaning that we would be making 2 side pieces. And we're going to be covering up the seams at the end anyway. And then we can just draw out our pattern onto our craft foam. And once we've cut out both pieces, we can heat form them to the shape of the leg. And then we can just glue them straight on using our contact cement. This is my favorite type of glue. I use it all of the time. The tricky thing here was just making sure that there were no like weird gaps or overlap in the back of the leg. And I said that this was going to be a waffle, and waffles aren't flat. So now we have to make the little crisscross grid layer that goes on top. We use our pattern from earlier to create 2 more side pieces, and then we just measure out and draw a little grid. And then we can just sit here for ages and cut out the tiny little squares. Then we can use that waffle grid piece to pattern out the grid waffle piece for the other side. And it doesn't have to be perfect because waffles aren't perfect. I didn't think I'd ever say that, but it is true. And once we've cut out that piece, we can glue them straight onto the leg. I used a detail tip hot glue gun for this because I didn't want any of the hot glue to sort of seep out the edges. Once everything's glued on, we can put on some Mod Podge to prepare the waffle for painting. We start off by just putting down like a flat beige coat, and we're hanging out with King Crimson in the background there because the pattern made me think of him. If you've been following me on TikTok for a while, you've probably heard me mention my awesome housemate Joey. They are super good at like paint mixing and like all kinds of different art stuff, and I'm kind of terrible at mixing paint, so they actually mixed all 4 colors on this waffle for me, and it just looks so much better than what I had before, so like, thank you, Joey. The different colors are really important to make it look a little bit more realistic, and less like flat, like it was just 2 pieces of craft foam glued together or something. And here is our waffle leg all painted. Then we just seal in our paint with some Mod Podge and it's done for now. But we will be coming back to it in a little bit for one last detail. I wanted one of the legs to be made of fairy floss, or candy floss if you're American. And I decided to use wadding for that soft, fluffy texture. So Butterscotch's legs actually have this little shelf that juts out just above the hoof. And because we don't want that to be visible, the first thing to do is to cut out a thin strip of wadding. And we're basically just gluing that in there to soften that edge. Once that's on, we can just use our contact cement to glue on the rest of the wadding. And we just go slowly, section by section, until the whole lower leg is covered. And then we're ready for painting. So full disclosure, I actually had to do this twice because I hated how it looked the first time. So this is what I'm showing you now. This is me painting it the first time. And I did several coats of paint, and that was my downfall. When the wadding had too much paint on it, it became very like stringy and like clumpy and gross and weird. I kept trying to fluff it out and add more paint, and it just did not work. So this is what it looked like at the end, and it looks like some kind of deep sea abomination. So I just decided to hack it off with a knife and start over. My awesome housemate Joey suggested adding a blue section to make it look a little bit more like fairy floss. So I must have been feeling very optimistic to not immediately get rid of the pink. But as you can see, the blue looks loads better. 1 coat of paint is really the way to go with this. But the pink still looks terrible, so we get the knife back out, and we can all just pretend that none of this ever happened. So then we take a new piece of wadding and glue that on section by section to cover up the mistakes of the past. And then it's time to paint it again, but properly this time. And then it's done. However, Candymare still has a blank flank, and we're gonna help her by gluing on that peppermint we made earlier. I didn't video it, but I did gloss coat this just to make it a little bit shinier. So we just slather on some contact cement and then we can stick it straight on. And it's so bright and shiny. I think it looks really cool. And now we can jump away from the legs and over to the chest mouth. And this next bit is really just us laying the foundations for what's going to happen later. So those little silver pieces you can see are actually touch sensors. So when Butterscotch is on and you give her a little pat there, she'll respond and do something. And we really need to keep that in mind while building Candymare. Don't quote me on this, but I think she has 7 touch sensors in total, and it would just be a real shame to lose any of that interactivity from those. So before we can do anything else on Candymare, we need to cut out some black fabric for this bit. And this is just to make it so that the inside of her chest mouth will be black and we can build on top of it later. We just take our contact cement and glue it down bit by bit. And we just have to make sure that it's nice and smooth with no wrinkles. Cool, so that's done for now. And we'll be coming back to her chest mouth much later in the video. But for now, let's jump over to the neck. So this is just the very base pattern for the neck. I'm doing a bit of a motion test here because if the neck pattern isn't big enough, the neck won't be able to move properly. And the cool thing about animatronics is that they move around and do stuff, and we don't want to limit that. So we're going to make the neck into a candy cane. And we're going to do that by sewing together strips of red and white vinyl. But first, we have to figure out where all of our strips are going to go, which we can do by measuring out these diagonal lines. Because these pieces are all going to get cut out individually, it's really important that they get labeled correctly. So W for white pieces, R for red pieces, and then they're all numbered from the top down, and that's going to really help us when it's time to actually sew them together. And once they're all labeled, we can cut them out. Now, most fabric will heal if you poke a pin through it, like the fibers will move around and then you won't be able to see the hole anymore, but vinyl does not do that. So instead of using pins to secure our pattern pieces, we're just going to have to use tape. So we just stick them down one by one and cut them all out. It's really important to leave a little bit of space around each edge on each piece. This is called a seam allowance. Because we made the pattern the exact size that it needs to be, if we cut everything out at the exact size and then just sew it all together, it'll end up too small. Once we've got all of our pieces, it's time to start pinning them together in order. And it's okay to use pins for this bit because it's going to be inside of the seam and no one's going to see it. And once it's all pinned, we can just run it through a sewing machine. Now this next step is really important. So we're going to clip the seams, and this is usually done on something with like a big curved seam or like a really sharp corner. It basically just gives the fabric enough room to sit nicer. And these seams aren't exactly curved, but Candymare's neck is kind of curved and the vinyl that we're using is a little bit stiff. And clipping the seams is just going to help it sit a little bit more naturally. So that's what this is, and you just do a bunch of tiny notches along your seam. And then it's time to pin it onto her body. I can't put this bit through the sewing machine, so this part has to be hand sewn. It's pretty hard to sew through this many layers of vinyl, so it's okay to be a little bit messy. And this part's going to be covered up by the main later anyway. Now this white vinyl was bought for Candymare, so I knew that I had enough. But the red vinyl has just been hanging out with my other fabric for like 7 years. These animatronics are really expensive to make, so I'm just trying to avoid buying as much stuff as possible. And this is probably a good time to mention that this whole project was funded by a few really cool people on TikTok. And I just wanted to take a moment to say a really big thank you to everyone listed here. I really love customizing these animatronics, like it's such a fun hobby, but there's no way that I'd be able to do nearly as many cool fun projects without you guys. So thank you for literally paying for Candymare. Coincidentally, everyone listed here also fully funded Fetch from FNAF. And I just wanted to say thank you guys so much. And thank you to everyone who's watching this video or any of my other videos. Thank you guys. The amount of support is overwhelming. Thank you. But it's time for the next part of Candymare. I really wanted to make one of her legs a candy cane, and thankfully we had just enough red vinyl left over. So we used some wadding to pad out her leg ledge. Her ledge, if you will. And then we do exactly what we just did with the neck, but with her leg. I'm not going to make you sit through all of that again. So here's just like a really fast little compilation. We're actually super lucky here because there was enough red vinyl left over for another leg. So we do the exact same process again. Riveting stuff, I know. But at the end of it, all 4 of her legs are done, which is very cool, and it means that we can move on to the next step. And the next step is her face. Before we do anything else, the first thing I want to do is her eyes. Butterscotch has nice and shiny eyes, which is not a good surface for painting on. So we go in and scuff them up a bit with some sandpaper and some some terps. Next up, I spend way too much time cleaning up this little mouthpiece. This is the inside top bit of her mouth, and I don't even end up using this piece. Because her jaw is in such bad shape, it's easier to just redo the whole thing with foam. So we can just completely ignore this bit. All of the latex on this Butterscotch's mouth was super sticky and gross, and I tried so hard to clean it all up. Anyway, ignoring that, now we can do a few coats of Mod Podge on her eyes. Candymare has these really awesome bright teal and pink swirly eyes, and I tried to sort of replicate that here. We also ended up giving her some like brighter pink eyelids, which I think looks pretty cool. And then we can just seal the paint in with some Mod Podge. So next up, half of Candymare's face is a skull, and the other half of it is the same pink fur as her body. If you can see that tiny little black circle in between her eyes, that's actually a light sensor. So when you leave Butterscotch in a dark room, she will go to sleep, and when it is light again, she will wake back up, which is nothing short of terrifying. But it's important to me that we don't cover that up because I think it's really cool. So we're just going to draw on where the two halves of her face are going to meet because it's not perfectly split down the middle. And we're also drawing a guide for where her mouth is going to end. You can see that she's got these cutout bits of her face just above her nostrils. And we don't want those little divots on the finished product, so we're going to fill them in with some craft foam. I made this pattern by sticking duct tape to her face and then just drawing on it, and then we can just cut it out and use contact cement to glue it on. Now that her face is smooth, the next step is to remove her teeth, and that just unscrews really easily. I just love how Butterscotch's toothpiece is. I think I'm going to make it into like earrings or a necklace. So Butterscotch has a little button in her mouth. I don't actually have it, but she comes with a little plastic carrot that you can kind of feed her with, but it's really just pressing the button. So if you press the button in her mouth, she'll kind of pretend to eat. And that's very cool, but we can't just leave her lower jaw the way that it is. So we're just trying to cut out around the button and wires without actually damaging anything important. And thankfully, nothing bad happened. With everything still working, it's time to remodel her jaw. So we just make a rough pattern and cut it out of some craft foam. And we can just use contact cement to stick that straight onto the back part of her lower jaw. Now we can just take our heat gun and heat form the mouth a little bit, just so it's a little bit more three-dimensional. It's best to use 2 layers of craft foam here because otherwise it'll be pretty flimsy. So we can just glue another piece on and then round out our edges using a Dremel. At this point, the glue that I'd ordered had finally come in. I really wanted to do some kind of cool topping or syrup for the waffle, and my very clever boyfriend suggested using hot glue gun sticks that were glittery. I think this was a really fun detail to add, and you can cover up any seams or any weird little bits. Excellent. Anyway, back to the jaw reconstruction. This is a little pattern piece for the very front part of the lower jaw. I had to keep Googling what a horse's face looked like from the front, which was just kind of horrifying. Real horses are way scarier to me than animatronic horses. But then we can just stick that straight on. She also has a few holes in her face that we're just going to fill up with a little piece of craft foam. And now we can finally get onto the good bit. To create a pattern for Candymare's face, we're going to cover her with cling wrap and then with duct tape. This is only for the skull side of her face. The skin part comes later. Also, sorry that my entire arm is in most of this shot. Candymare is absolutely massive and my workspace is pretty small. Honestly, filming this whole project was just super difficult. Once she's all covered in duct tape, we can take a Sharpie and start drawing on our lines. The first thing to do is her mouth, where her smile is going to be, and skulls are made up of lots of different like little plates. The actual name of them is kind of hard to pronounce, so I've started calling them jiggle plates because of this. And I had to look up what a horse skull looks like in order to do this. But we're drawing out approximately where the jiggle plates would be on a real horse. And that'll help to make Candymare a little bit more realistic. Cool, so that's our pattern done. So now we can label our pieces and how they connect to each other, and then we can cut the duct tape off her face and into pieces. We're using 1mm craft foam for the skull, and we can just draw on our pattern and cut it out. I kind of half color coded the pieces, just so that they'd be a little bit easier to work with. And this is what it looks like all glued on. Very colorful, very cool. The inside mouth bit needs to look like one flat, smooth piece. So we're just going in with the Dremel to smooth it out a bit. You can't really tell here, but that white plastic bit at the front is actually sticking out quite a lot. And it's going to look kind of silly if we leave that in. Unfortunately, directly behind it are a bunch of wires for the mouth, and we really don't want to cut those. So I end up shoving this strip of EVA foam in there and trying to like pad it out. I felt like a dentist. But it worked and no wires got cut. After Mod Podging it, we can move on to painting. The first thing we're going to paint is a bit of grey just inside the crevices. Hopefully this will darken them up and help provide a little bit of contrast. And then we put down a beige layer. The hope here is that it'll show through a little bit at the end. And then we can put down our white paint. Next up, we start contouring it and making it look a little bit dirty. I'm mostly just following the lines that are already there on Candymare's head, but Frog King on TikTok actually has a horse skull and sent me a bunch of really good photo references of it, so I used those to try and be a little bit more accurate. I'm not really the best at painting, but I tried. Thank you, Frog King. Candymare didn't have any nostrils, and I felt like it was important that she did, so we're just gonna paint some on while we're here. And after just a few more little touch-ups, her skull is done. Apparently, I didn't film this at all, but the next step is to glue on the pink fabric to the rest of her face. So we glue that on and tuck the excess into her head cap. And then it's time to cut out her smile. It's important to be careful here because we want her smile to be relatively symmetrical. Not that the rest of her face is symmetrical, but still. And here she is, looking absolutely horrifying. The next step is to fix up the inside of her mouth. She has that eating button in there and just a bunch of wires. And we can't have that. So we're gonna board up the back of her throat with a piece of craft foam. It's not ideal that her mouth can't just be fully open, but it's probably better if she doesn't have just a bunch of visible wires hanging out of her mouth. So we can just cut that out and glue it in with a bit of contact cement. We need to do the same for the inner top and bottom of her mouth as well. And we can just glue those in with some hot glue. I don't really like using hot glue. It doesn't have a very strong bond, and 99% of the time it is not the best glue for the job. But I needed something that would set quickly that I could move around a little bit, so we're using it here. So we just glue in her upper and lower mouthpieces and she's back to normal, sort of. I'm really happy about this because the way that her old jaw was just kind of dangling there was super unnerving. And the craft foam is soft enough to sort of bend when you touch it, so you can still click the eating button through the foam, which is very cool. And once we've done a few coats of Mod Podge, we can move on to painting the inside of her mouth. And this is being done in a very dark red color. So she can kind of chew, but she doesn't really have any teeth, so we're gonna give her some. We're going to be making them out of EVA foam. So we've made 3 little triangle patterns that are all slightly different, and we're just gonna trace those over and over again onto a piece of EVA foam. Each tooth is gonna be 2 pieces of foam, so we're just marking out which piece was made from which pattern piece so that they're easier to pair up later. Our teeth need to be more varied than just having 3 different types, but this is just a guide. Some of you might recognize that pattern piece that's drawn on there. That is from our Sally Face pony's leg. And once we've drawn out approximately enough teeth, we can start cutting them out. Then we can start gluing them together. The reason each tooth is 2 pieces is because we want them to be really 3-dimensional. As we're shaping it with the Dremel here, we don't want it to be too flat or boring. Candymare has a lot of big, bright teeth, and it'll look cooler if they're not just kind of flat like paper. So that's what we're trying to do here. Candymare's teeth took ages to make just because she has so many of them. But I feel like they're very important to her design. And we're gonna have even more, even bigger teeth to make soon. So this is our tooth pile, and now that they've all been sanded down, we need to skewer them. And then we can heat seal our teeth. The teeth aren't very visually interesting just yet, so we're going to add some detail to each tooth. So this tool is called a hot knife. It basically just has a little metal tip that heats up and gets really hot. And they can be used for a lot of different things, but for our teeth, we're going to use it to melt away parts of the foam, to just give it a little bit more detail. This is our fun little Vocaloid Fear Garden moment. Once we're happy with how they look, we can Mod Podge them to prepare our teeth for painting. For better or for worse, I am a Homestuck cosplayer, so I did actually have all of the candy corn colors. Also, I'm Australian and I've eaten candy corn exactly once. And all of the Homestuck trolls have candy corn horns, and I assumed that that was exactly what candy corn looked like. But I assumed wrong because real candy corn has white in it, and Homestuck horns are 2 oranges and a yellow. But I still had all of the paint, so it's fine. So we put on our white before moving on to the orange. I'm trying to do a little bit of a gradient here, and that's how I color Homestuck horns, but I think it looks cool, so we're gonna do that here. It's just non-canon candy corn, and that's okay. Once the orange is dry, we can do the same thing with the yellow, and then seal all of our paint in with some Mod Podge. And now that our teeth are done, we can start gluing them into her head. I didn't make enough teeth here, so I had to go back and make more, but that's fine, and here's what she looks like with all of her teeth in. I don't know about you guys, but I think that she has a beautiful smile. Now we can move on to making her tongue. We're gonna make this out of the EVA foam just because it's the cheapest option. So we pattern it, cut it out, and Dremel it down. The EVA foam floor mats we're using has that textured side, which is definitely not ideal for something like this, but I really didn't want to go and buy more foam just for the tongue. So we can just sand that bit down until it's smooth. I'm not really sure if this is a thing that people do, but I just took some thread clippers and tidied up the edges. The edge pieces are really, really thin, so it got kind of hard to Dremel. And this is just to tidy it up a little bit. Once we're happy with our tongue base, we can heat seal it, Mod Podge it, and then paint it. A yellow and orange striped tongue is pretty consistent in fan art of Candymare, so that's what we're doing here too. And we're just going to freehand on the orange, because if we can't freehand stuff on Candymare, when will we be able to? Once our tongue is dry, we can use a spray to gloss coat it, and then we can use contact cement to stick it into her mouth. As you can see, one of the things that I really like about EVA foam is that you can kind of bend it, which means I can do stupid things like this. With the tongue finished, we can now move on to making her gums. I don't know if gums is exactly the right word, but it is what kind of hides the edges of the teeth, so I guess. The glitter glue for the waffle came in a pack of 4 colors, and one of them is red, which is perfect for our gums. I also used the same red glitter glue for the line between the skull and fur parts of her face. I kind of forgot to mention that, sorry, but that's what that is. I feel like adding the gums really pulls her face together, and it kind of helps disguise that her teeth are just glued on there. Next up, it's time to finish up her eye area. To give her eyes a more striking look, we're going to be adding some black paint. Stanley and Sewer Pony both had this as well, so it's basically just eyeliner for scary horses. So as we're painting that on, we're just guiding it outwards a little bit so that it doesn't look like a perfect circle. And now we can start making Candymare some eyelashes. While I did pattern these from scratch, they were sort of loosely based on Rarity's eyelashes. I thought about it for a bit, and I think that Rarity has the nicest eyelashes in the show. So we're basically going to steal them for Candymare. Toby Horrorboy, animatronic customizer and eyelash thief. And if you're watching this, you're my accomplice. So we are officially in this together. Anyway, we trace and cut those out. Normally I would be doing this with a precision knife, but I don't seem to have one at this point in my life. So please excuse the fact that I'm using scissors. And now we can heat form them to be eyelash shaped. I'm sure you guys know by now, but now it's time to Mod Podge it. Now Candymare's eyelashes are going to be black, but we have to paint them black anyway. Because otherwise, instead of a nice shiny painted black, it'll just be sad raw foam color. And we don't want that, it has to be pigmented. And once that's dry, we can take some contact cement and glue them in. This feels very much like putting on real false eyelashes, which I feel like I am notoriously bad at. But maybe it's easier when you do it on other people and ponies, because it worked. She's looking very stylish. So as you can sort of see here, Butterscotch's eye mechanism is one piece. So she gives the illusion of blinking by tilting her eye down in her skull, and her eyelashes are attached to that piece. Which is a really smart way of making this, but it does mean that she just has all of this white plastic exposed when she blinks. That bit is covered on Butterscotch, but it is not covered anymore on Candymare. So we're going to paint that up just to make it a little bit less noticeable. Now that Candymare's face is finished, we can move down to her chest mouth. We're going to make her some big candy corn teeth, the same way that we made her others. This little pattern piece here is more of a size guide than a shape guide. Because the chest mouth area is so big, we can basically just do whatever we want and give her some really cool big fangs. There is no wrong answer, we just have to make a lot of them. And once we've matched up the pairs and glued them together, this is our pile so far. And spoiler, this is not enough teeth. Once we've sanded them down, just like last time, we can use the hot knife again to create some cool textures and patterns. Then we can Mod Podge them, paint them, and Mod Podge them again. And then we can start gluing our teeth in. My housemate pointed out that this looks a lot like Venom's teeth, and it really just made me want to make a cool Venom puppet, so maybe one day. We put some of the smaller or more angled teeth at the front, so that we can still easily access the touch sensor. Once all of her teeth are glued in, we can give her some gums with the hot glue. I did run out of hot glue about halfway through this, so we're gonna have to put it on pause for now and come back to it later. So this is our second Butterscotch, the one that we borrowed the battery pack from. And you'll notice that she has significantly more ears than our first Butterscotch. Perhaps not the perfect number of ears, but we take what we can get with the Butterscotch ear economy. So this ear is like a soft rubber with fur stuck to it, and I was fully intending to rip it off to use it as a pattern. But I couldn't actually get it off, so I don't know how there are so many Butterscotches out there with missing ears. I guess that the average child has significantly more arm strength than me, which is fine. So failing that, we're just gonna have to pattern our own. Even though pony ears are probably pretty thin, I didn't want to use the 1mm thick craft foam. I just thought that it would be a little bit too thin down at the base. So we're going to sand it down with the Dremel to make it a lot thinner, but still thicker than a piece of craft foam. Now the ears are going to be a waffle, much like the leg. So we need to trace out our ear shape and cut it out of craft foam. We need 4 pieces, front and back, left and right. And the craft foam is going to be our little crisscross layer. Once we've cut those out, we can draw on our crisscross. Now we can cut out all of the holes, apparently still using scissors. Even recording this audio now, I still don't have a precision knife. I'm setting a rule now that I need to go and buy one before we do the Fazwatch cover, because we're going to need it for all of those tiny little pieces. And they're like $3, so there's really no excuse. Once we've got one crisscross layer patterned and cut out, we can use it as a pattern for our 3 other pieces. And now we can glue all of our ear pieces together. We've drawn where the waffle is going to go onto the base piece, so that we shouldn't have too much glue spilling over the sides. Not that it really matters, because we can just say that it's syrup or something, but still. Once all of our pieces are glued down, we can trim down our edges, just to give it a smoother finish. And now we can finally heat form our ears into being ear-shaped. However, before we get it ready for painting, there's something else we have to do. We've got one more waffle to make. Candymare is often depicted as having part of her torso being made out of waffle, and we're going to do that by putting a waffle on her back. So on a regular Butterscotch, this is where one would normally sit. So, same deal as before, we make a pattern and cut it out of our EVA foam. And then we make our little crisscross overlay. The craft foam here wasn't big enough, but I really didn't want to go and buy more. So our crisscross is just going to have to be spread across 2 pieces. Next, we can heat form the main part of the waffle to Candymare's back. I don't know why I didn't think to film the main shot of this, but please enjoy this view of the floor. Next, we glue on our top layer and trim down the edges. Then we can do a little bit of a touch-up with the Dremel just to make sure that it's all smooth. And then we can do a coat of Mod Podge on our back waffle and our ear waffles to get them ready for painting. The reason that we had to put a pause on finishing the ears earlier is that, like with the leg waffle, my amazing housemate Joey had to mix all of the paint. I'm just not very good at it, and they are so good at it that it's almost like a superpower. But because they'd already helped me with the leg, I didn't want to have to call them back in on 2 separate occasions for the ears and for the back waffle. So they just mixed up a lot of paint for me, and then I did it all in one go. So can everyone please once again say, thank you, Joey. They're a real lifesaver. So we put down our weird beige undercoat, and then we start painting on and layering all of the colors that they mixed. So we do like a light pastry color over our highest point, and then a much darker orangish brown inside of the squares. And then we do some more colors that I didn't film, and they're done. I think that this is the part of Candymare that makes me the hungriest to look at. Like I was sitting there and all I could smell was paint, but I wanted to bite it so badly. And once we've Mod Podged all of our pieces, we can glue down our back waffle. The back waffle went on easily, but unfortunately the ears were a little bit trickier. So the part of the ear that makes it move is that little white plastic bit, and it is very small and there's not a lot of surface area to work with. I cut a little hole on the underside of each ear and just covered everything in glue and just slotted that little piece in. It worked and the ears stayed on fine, but they do feel pretty fragile. Now we can take our hot gold glitter glue and add some syrup to her ears. And we can do some cool little drippy bits, because why not? And then we can do the same to her back. And with that done, it is finally time to go and fix the tail. So I didn't actually figure out how to do this myself. There's a channel here on YouTube called WayneU72 who has a fantastic tutorial on how to fix Butterscotch's tail. Like, please know that I didn't come up with any of this. I just followed that tutorial and it worked. Really great tutorial, super easy to follow. I'm going to run you guys through how to do it here, but it is just me repeating what they've already said. So there's a little screw, and you unscrew it and you take that piece out. And then you get some clear vinyl tubing. I used 5mm. WayneU72 suggests 5/16 of an inch vinyl tubing, but I live in Australia and nothing is in inches here, so the 5mm stuff worked for me. And you cut off around like 4 centimeters of it. Also, I do have enough vinyl tubing to fix another 124 Butterscotch tails, so if we can all just start thinking about more horse characters to make, that would be great. I am joking, that was a joke. We are not making another 124 horses. I simply don't have the space. So then we take the little plastic piece that we took out, and it has a little hole on it. And we need to recreate that hole on our tube, so we're going to draw it on, and then drill it all the way through. Please be really careful when using power tools, and don't do whatever it is that I'm trying to do with this drill. The hole has to be exactly the right size to fit the little screw back through. And then we just screw the pieces together. If you look really closely in there, you can see the piece that's snapped off. So all we have to do now is slot the tube over that piece. I ended up actually gluing this in just to be extra sure that it wouldn't fall off again. And her tail works again. Awesome. So now it's finally time to actually make the tail. We're going to be using spaghetti yarn, which I didn't know existed. It's just t-shirt fabric cut into little strips. Candymare's hair is like red and black licorice, but they didn't have any black, so we're going to dye some of this. So we just chuck our dye packet in, stir it around until it's dissolved, and then we can add in our spaghetti yarn. And we just stir that around for about 40 minutes. As you can see, it is decidedly purple and not black. But honestly, I kind of love how it turned out. And like, why not add another color to her hair? So now we can rinse the excess dye out of it, and this thing took so long to dry. It's just this tangled monstrosity. Thankfully, I already had some black t-shirt fabric, so while waiting for that to dry, we're gonna cut up some strips of that. And now this is what we have to work with. Also, we're very lucky that my dad had several large coils of wire that he gave me a couple of years ago. I don't know what person would need as much wire as he had, but it's mine now and we're going to use a little bit of it. So we're going to start cutting our wire into pieces. And that is going to be the core of each piece of the tail and mane. And then we cut our red and purple fabric into sections as well. I believe that what we're doing here is called a twist braid. We are gluing all of the pieces to the wire and themselves, just as neatly as we can get it at one end, and then holding on to that end and twisting all of the fabric around the wire. And then you just glue it down at the other end and that's one piece done. This was by far the single longest process for Candymare. It took ages to make all of these pieces. I wasn't really keeping track of how long it took, but I do know that I watched 8 episodes of Star Trek during this, and also some other stuff, so it just took a really long time. We also made these in a bunch of different color combinations, so it wasn't just the same 3 colors each time. And that'll just help our mane and tail be a little bit more visually interesting. I only made enough for the tail at first because it was just taking so long, but once all of our tail pieces are made, we can start gluing them onto the tail stub. Butterscotch's original tail is like a fur cover, so it has these little oval pieces to help bulk out the tail. But for us, those are just in the way, so we cut those off and then glue down the rest of the pieces to the flatter surface. And that's what our tail looks like all together. This is the gluing that I was talking about earlier. It's very important to put glue on both the tail stub and also on the inside of the body. But with the inside of the body part, you can only put the glue on the bit that moves, because if you put it on the outside bit, it might kind of all get stuck together and then not move at all. So that's the tail finished and glued on. Please ignore that weird ripple, I do fix that later. And apparently I didn't film it actually moving, but it does work. Sorry guys, I'll show it at the end of the video when she's done. So her waffle is looking a little bit plain. So the plan here was to make some whipped cream out of an air dry clay. There was like a piping tip and a sandwich bag involved, and it didn't work. The bag kept breaking and it just wasn't working out, so please disregard that you've seen any of this, and instead please enjoy this video of me shoving wet clay through a piping tip with my bare hands. I often get comments from people upset with me that I have taken a kid's toy and customized it to be creepy, because even if it's in the op shop, another kid could come along and really love it. And like, I do understand where they're coming from, but I'm not like breaking it and smashing it to pieces. It still works and it's still cool. And I get to share it with all of you guys, which I really love doing. And hopefully if you're watching this extremely long video, you also like seeing the customized stuff. So I don't really consider that to be like morally wrong. I think I'm just using the product in a way that wasn't intended, and that's okay. I think what's morally wrong is me just taking clumps of air dry clay in my hands, wetting them with my drink bottle, which is covered in air dry clay all over the outside, wet air dry clay, and then piping it really badly. Like, no cake decorating should ever look like this. No waffle should ever look like this. But my bag kept breaking, and it's Candymare, so it's fine if it's more than a little bit messy. But please, this is the worst animatronic crime I've done. So far, at least. I guess there's still time. Anyway, moving swiftly along. My new microphone just arrived, and it is so much better than the inbuilt microphone that I was using before. This is what all of my videos are gonna sound like in the future. Listen to that, it's not crunchy anymore. Amazing, I love it already. So I put it to a vote on TikTok, and the majority agreed that the second mouth was just a little bit plain. So we're gonna give her another, much bigger tongue. So we pattern it and cut it out of foam. As you can see, the tongue is too big for the foam piece that we have. So we're going to separate the two pieces with a diagonal cut. And the reason that we're doing a diagonal cut is so that when we paint it later, we can just paint a stripe along that line. And that'll help disguise the seam a little bit. Please pretend that you didn't see me cut through EVA foam with scissors. I was kind of going through it, clearly. And now we can stick the two halves of our tongue together with contact cement. And you guys know the drill by now. First of all, we Dremel it down, and then we heat seal and form it before Mod Podging it, and then we can paint it. TikTok user Nick Rivers suggested like a blue and red sort of blue raspberry theme for the tongue, and I really loved that idea, so that's what we ended up doing. And then we can just spray gloss coat it and glue it in with contact cement, keeping in mind that we need to glue it slightly to the side to avoid the touch sensor on her chest, like in her mouth, inside the mouth that's on her chest. Yeah, so congratulations if you've made it this far into the video. We're almost 40 minutes in, but we are now in the final stages of Candymare. This video was never supposed to be this long. I'm not sure what happened, but we're gonna try and power through the rest. Let's go. Once again, it is glitter glue time. So we're gonna start off by adding some more to the back. It just looked kind of odd with absolutely none of the glue being on the whipped cream. I don't really eat much whipped cream personally, but if I did, I would want there to be syrup on it and not just on everything else except for that. And then we can take the red glitter glue and fill in the rest of the chest mouth gums that we missed earlier. And it was always the plan to take whatever leftover glue we had and give her some gross saliva. Weird candy saliva that's gonna wiggle when she moves her head. And she has two tongues, so double the candy saliva, I guess. Now, there were two parts on Candymare that just made her look unfinished. There's a few centimeters where her neck meets her body where you can see the white plastic of the animatronic underneath. And also on the back of the Peppermint, I didn't fully paint it because I didn't think that I would need to, but you can definitely see that there's just this unpainted black foam section. Thankfully, the solution to both is the same. More fairy floss. We've got heaps of wadding scrap, so we just cut some out and we just paint it. Exactly the same as we did way at the beginning of the video. But this time I've misplaced my big fluffy brush, so it's a little bit less good. And we just glue both of those on to hide the offending areas. With the neck cover up, I tried to do like a blue fairy floss to pink fairy floss to pink skin kind of transition. Because that's what she is. She's the Candymare and she's partially made of candy, I guess. Like, that's what I was thinking when I was doing that, but no one else is ever gonna realize that, so it's just a secret between me and the three of you guys that are still watching this. Hello, thank you for being here. Now, looking at the neck, that's not actually glued on. Like, it is at the very base, but not at the top. So we just glue that down, and now when she moves her head, her neck will follow. My stitching along the back of the neck is truly horrendous, and that is why we are taking strips of what the mane is made of and just gluing it over the top. And this will help hide the stitching, it'll make it look a bit nicer, and maybe it'll even give the mane a little bit of something extra to grab onto when we glue it down. I really wanted the mane to be the absolute last thing done on Candymare because I glued it down during a Twitch livestream with some of you guys. But it isn't time for that yet, so I'm going to talk about that when we get to it. What it is finally time for is the battery compartment. On an original Butterscotch, there is a Velcro closure over the battery compartment, as is common for most toys that have battery compartments. So we need to add our own Velcro back in. And this was like a whole saga. I really hated this bit. Like, this was the worst part of Candymare, full stop, because I had to lay on the ground underneath her the way that a mechanic might to look at a car. It was super awkward, it was kind of hard to film. I just had my phone flat on the ground next to me pointing up, and I had to just try and pin everything down while I was scared that this battery pack was gonna fall on my face. I don't know what it is about Butterscotch's battery pack in particular, but it's horrible, it's super heavy, it's really big, and like you have to put it up and then slide it across and then you have to screw it in while holding it. It's so difficult to put the batteries in. Honestly, I think that even if my Tourette's hadn't messed up my arm muscles, I think I would still be really weak, and I think that this would still be super difficult. Anyway, the point is that it kind of sucked, but at least it didn't take that long. And thankfully I could do almost all of the actual sewing sitting upright next to her. So we just hand sew on the Velcro and that's that. And now it's time for the main final bit. Sorry. But yes, the mane. Animatronics that are supposed to have hair always look super weird until you put hair on them. So I was so happy when I finally got up to this point. So I streamed most of this on Twitch and then like didn't really record a lot of footage. So my boyfriend knows like a lot about horses and he helped me so much, especially with this bit. So basically the way we glued on the mane was to have the piece like pointing in one direction and to have like that bit be glued on and to then flip the whole piece around. So you're kind of creating a U shape, but if a U was like really short on one side and really long on the other. And then it looks good from all angles, and apparently that's what horsehair is like. So this was my first ever Twitch stream, and I've decided that I'm going to be doing some crafting streams on there. And probably also other types of stream, but like crafting streams in particular. So my channel name there is horrorboycosplay, same as everywhere else. And I'll put a link to that in the description. And if you guys would like to come along to any streams that I'm doing at any point, that would be cool. I would love that. I typically announce my live streams on my Instagram, and there are also semi-frequently photos of my cat on my Instagram story, so you might want to check that out as well. I don't mind. Anyway, this was really fun and I can't wait to stream again. But back to Candymare, I had a bunch of people suggesting to add butter to the waffle as well, which I made out of high density foam and barely filmed. But that's the last real piece. I mean, the thing about Candymare is that you could just keep adding things forever, so maybe in like 6 months to a year I'll pick her back up and like just start adding some more candy things. We'll have to see how I feel then. So this is just made out of high density foam, pretty standard stuff. We just made it the same way we'd made all of the other foam pieces. But I wanted the butter to look a little bit melted, so I took some foam clay and kind of blended it into the edge there and just kind of made it drip down. And with that done, there's just one last thing to do. And then we'll do the big reveal. As I mentioned earlier in the video, this whole project was entirely funded by you guys. Unfortunately, often making stuff is just really expensive, especially when it comes to big projects like this. So making Candymare like this was actually only possible because a few really cool people donated. And I said that if anyone donated, I would write their name on the battery compartment. I know it's not a lot, but now your names are forever on this Butterscotch animatronic. So thank you everyone so much for watching, but a huge thank you in particular to Derpity, Logan, whose mum's username is Caitlin Dancypants, Mazarine Cosplay, ChaosDuck.cos, The Name's Tree, and user 6WHKS6D7I. Thank you guys so much. I am so glad that we got to make Candymare. You guys also funded Fetch from FNAF, so in a few months I'll be writing your names down on that battery box as well. Thank you guys again so much. Here's how she turned out. Butterscotch! Hey. No. Don't. What you doing? What you doing? Yes, you should be the star of the video. I know.